so we're kind of really looking forward to this virtual meeting. Sharon?
Yeah. And we tried, planning it and, but the closer it got, we worried about the possibility of having a large event and, exposing our friends and our fellow master gardeners to the virus. So we didn't want anyone to come to our event and not have fun and end up with the virus. So our committee's initial decision was to cancel it this year.
But then again, we thought, hey, let's don't cancel this. Let's just do the virtual thing. That seems to be the end thing right now anyway with COVID-19. So we moved forward with planning to do the virtual mini spring tonic and have a couple speakers, which we have lined up for you today. And but we want you guys keep us in mind for next year, because keep planning for the first Saturday of March of 2022 to plan on being at our live spring tonic at Orange County.
Thank you and welcome.
Yep. So enjoy the virtual mini today. Thank you. Maybe we're having problems.
Well, I see Abby's doing some troubleshooting and Molly doesn't have her camera on, but maybe I'll just go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Hans Schmitz. I'm Purdue Extension Ag and Natural Resource Educator in Posey County, and also a fellow advisor of the SWIMGA Association, Southwest Indiana Master Gardener Association, which is based out of Vanderburgh County, but incorporates volunteers from Posey, Vanderburgh, Warwick, and Gibson County. My background is as an agricultural meteorologist, so I know the flyer says that I'm going to cover climate today, but that's a very broad title, so I thought maybe I should actually make that a little bit more specific. And today I'm going to cover climate action strategies for gardeners. We're going to go into a little bit of extremes and trends, and I believe this is the third spring tonic, third, maybe second, that I've spoken at, so I won't belabor any points. Those of you with the Hoosier Hillsides have seen this presentation, part of this presentation before, so we'll just go into the history very quickly, talk about the 2050 outlook for South Central Indiana, and some of the trends that could also be seen for, I know we have individuals on from Central Indiana and Northern Indiana, so touch on that briefly, and then really focus on those action steps and strategies for climate adaptation and mitigation in the garden. I can't start this presentation without quickly saying weather is not the same as climate. Weather is the day-to-day variation in the Earth's atmosphere. It could be a thunderstorm. It could be a clear sunny week associated with a high pressure system, kind of like the week we've experienced down here in the last week. And then maybe the lifespan of a high pressure system that crosses the entire US, all weather phenomenon. But climate is the accumulation of these weather events over a long period of time. The World Meteorological Organization says that the minimum amount of time that you have to average a weather variable to reach a climate data point is 30 years. So minimum of 30 years could be the mean annual precipitation in Paoli, could be the change in high temperatures over the month of July for 40 years. So it could be longer than 30 years. So climate, by definition, is the 30-year average of a meteorological variable. That means climate change is the difference between the 30-year average of a variable and a different set of 30 years for that variable. So you can overlap, or you can have a whole new set of 30 years that you look at. So if we look at 1971 to 2000, that's a 30-year period that can create a climate data point. And if we look at 1981 to 2010, that's a new set of 30 years. That's a new data point. What we're coming up on this year is the 1991 to 2020 30-year averages. And the National Centers for Environmental Information are currently calculating those. And the new set of climate normals for 1991 to 2020 is planned to be available in mid-May of this year. Looking forward to that quite a bit. If we look at historical climate trends, Indiana has two separate climates. Southern Indiana has this dark green CFB climate, which is a warm, temperate, fully humid, and warm summer climate. Northern Indiana has the DFA, DFA climate, which is snow, fully humid, and hot summer. So the main difference between the two is the D versus C designation. So Southern Indiana, if we have a snow event, the milk and bread are gone and the kids are out of school. If Northern Indiana has a snow event, it probably better be greater than 6 inches for anyone to notice. And if it sticks around very long in Southern Indiana, we talk about it incessantly. If snow sticks around for 3-4 weeks in Northern Indiana, that's going to happen. And as we look at Central Indiana, it is kind of a transition zone. So I saw some folks in the chat talking about being from Shelby County. That's definitely Central Indiana, kind of in the transition zone between the two. And you experience kind of different things based on how the system's set up throughout the winter and through the summer as well. So you could go either way depending on how everything works out. When we look at maximum temperatures for the state of Indiana, in Orange County here, you see no trend whatsoever. So that's not something we experience in Indiana as far as a warming of our daily highs as we look at a long period of time. Our minimum temperatures through, and this is just for the summertime, are increasing slightly in Orange County, according to NOAA's Climate at a Glance tool here. But they're not increasing at a very rapid rate. Certain areas of the state do see a more rapid minimum temperature in the summertime increase. And that's one thing that we look at because that does add to plant stress in the garden. What we see, particularly for Southern Indiana, is an increase in precipitation. This extends to Northern Indiana, but it's more pronounced in Southern Indiana. And if we look at Orange County here, over a 1/2 inch increase in precipitation per decade on the trend line. And this is for the entire state, also seeing an increase in trend. And if you look at just the period from 1960 on, where that red dashed line is, you see a more pronounced increase. Extreme precipitation events, likewise, are also increasing in Indiana. And I don't want to belabor the scale, but basically, if you take the 99th percentile of events, the very extreme precipitation events that will cause flooding, the number of days has increased by about 2 days across the entire state. If we look just at South Central Indiana, where Orange and Crawford would be, you see an increase from 3 days in 1950 that would have a 24-hour period with greater than 1.25 inches of precipitation, which would be considered to saturate soils, up to about 9 days, and that's a decade ago in 2010. Here's newer information. This is a screen grab from a recent webinar featuring Aaron Wilson and Robin Wilson, both with Ohio State University. And basically, if you look at the graph there, you see 1 day max precipitation in inches per decade, and that swath right along the Ohio River and a little bit that extends up into central Indiana of very blue. So large increase in 1 day maximum precipitation. And that's the main climate change variable that concerns us for southern Indiana. The growing season throughout the state is lengthening. The plant hardiness zone maps are changing a little bit. This is the 2012 map, and this is the most recent map. We'd expect to see in the next couple of years a new map come out, but you see that southern Indiana is generally in zone 6, northern Indiana generally in zone 5, and all the plant hardiness zones are what would you expect to see is the coldest temperature on the coldest night in winter. So don't put too much stock in plant hardiness zones, but if you want to look at perennials versus annuals and what is what where, plant hardiness zones is one descriptor that we can use to kind of get at what plants should be placed where. Sulfur deposition is changing, and as we look at that deposition from 1986 to 2017 here, you see basically that the Clean Air Act of 1990 worked. We're not getting sulfur out of coal-fired plants anymore, and as a result of that, we do see maybe a need for consideration of sulfur on in our plants in the garden. So let's look at the models for the future. What we're going to see based on Indiana Climate Change Impact Assessment reports is that the days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit for, this is Orange County data, is going to increase by about threefold. And this would be for the 2041 to 2070 averages. So that's concerning. We're going to have more heat stress. The hottest day of the year, as we look into the future 2050s, 2080s, is going to increase potentially from 97 degrees up into the hundreds. Warmer nighttime temperatures, particularly in the summer, those days where the low temperatures stay above 68, increasing 2 to 3-fold. And that's concerning for plants because higher nighttime temperatures means a lot more energy spent on respiration and less energy for plant growth. Plant hardiness zone changes from 6A in the 2012 map to 7A. So increasing zone by an entire digit, which basically means a change from an expected minimum temperature from -10 to -5 up to 0 to 5 degrees. And that would be consistent with the change from where we're currently at to the kind of plant hardiness zone that you would see in Tennessee. Frost-free season is increasing. This has certainly been occurring and been observed, but it's going to continue. And that is maybe an opportunity for a little bit more of a growing season, a little bit more time to garden. Rain versus snow, that's predicted to decrease. Days with snow on the ground predicted to decrease. More water generally entering rivers, which means runoff is predicted to increase annually, but that's specifically pronounced in the winter and spring. So in the winter and spring, we would expect more flooding conditions, and we would expect to see a little bit of a decrease in summer and fall, a little bit more of a trend towards droughty conditions. So that's kind of where we're at, and we can choose to adapt to all of these different conditions. I want to take just a moment to talk about the last two bullet points that haven't been covered yet. The Climate Change Impact Assessment mentions ticks as a human health hazard as well as a pest that we could see more of. And you do see an increasing prevalence of those particular things in the region, and at with the longer growing season, longer frost-free season, you do see when those particular those particular beings are out in the environment increase as well. And then pluots is mentioned basically as we look at chilling degree or chilling hours that are required for some of our fruit varieties. Those are predicted to decrease, and chilling hours are required for fruit set on some of our tree fruits. So as we look at apple varieties that we may not be able to grow in southern Indiana in the future, maybe there's an opportunity for pluots to pop up in the landscape, which is a plum apricot hybrid. So general adaptation strategies, we know that we're receiving more extreme rainfall in southern Indiana. So the number one thing we need to do is manage water. And we can manage water in a variety of ways. Rain barrels is one thing that pops up because a lot of the water that falls is going to fall on impervious surfaces. So if we can find a way to capture that water that falls on impervious surfaces like roofs, we can then use that rain later on in the season or as needed in the landscape. Anytime we increase soil organic matter, we're going to increase our resilience to both floods and droughts. Soil organic matter is measurable on soil tests. And if we have less than 8% soil organic matter, then we have an opportunity to increase that percentage. If we have greater than 8% soil organic matter, we're starting to look at getting into muck soils and other things that are completely different type of management scenario. And we'll talk a little bit more on how to increase soil organic matter later. Rain gardens might be something that we will look at installing as we want to manage water in the landscape. Choosing our plantings, our planting locations, as well as the types of plants that we plant to be drought tolerant or to be tolerant of wet feet, depending on the conditions we're expecting, would be one way to manage water. And then a lot of our gardens or our landscapes have the opportunity for some type of outside irrigation, which in those potentially droughtier summers and falls would be one way to add water to the landscape. Other things we can do if we want to adapt with the higher nighttime temperatures, the increased stress, plants that have a C4 type of photosynthesis are a little more resilient to those higher nighttime temperatures. And they're more resilient because they can also withstand higher daytime temperatures. I won't go too far into the science here, but if you look at the basic temperature thresholds, C3 plants, which is the other type of photosynthesis, and there's a third called CAM, which is cacti. So we're just going to, disregard that for the time being. C3 plants start growing at 32 degrees. So anytime it's greater than freezing, C3 plants will photosynthesize. So that would be your cool season lawns. C4 plants don't begin photosynthesizing until 50 degrees Fahrenheit. C3 plants are going to optimize photosynthesis around 60 to 70 degrees. And then once it gets to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, C3 plants are going to stop photosynthesizing for however long a time period is greater than 86 degrees Fahrenheit. C4 plants optimize photosynthesis around 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and they won't stop photosynthesizing until we get to about 110 degrees, when water regulation in the plant is just unable to keep up. So if we see higher temperatures, if we see higher nighttime temperatures where we're getting to 86 degrees Fahrenheit within the first 3 or 4 hours of the day, C4 plants are going to have a little bit of optimization over C3 plants. And I can give some examples of the types of plants after the presentation in the chat. Greenhouse or hoop house production is an adaptation strategy. So basically you take it indoors where you're able to more readily regulate temperature and moisture on a intensive management basis, or you're better able to provide the climate that those crops need. And then we do have a longer growing season, so take advantage of that. An adaptation technique might be to go ahead and get those cool season crops out into the garden, your broccolis, your cauliflowers, and then go ahead and double crop in after that harvest into a warm season crop, or potentially the ability for uh, triple cropping, which is a lot more touchy, but technically possible in some of these very southern locations. A note here, uh, adaptation strategies are great, but we can mitigate some of the changes that we see in climate. And mitigate would be to prevent from occurring. So if we're going to mitigate in the garden, we're basically going to look at sequestering carbon, or we're going to look at reducing our overall carbon footprint. And some ways that we can do that in the garden is, number one, anything involved with soil health. And soil health is a big term in row crop agriculture that's being promoted a little bit more in home horticulture as well now. And all of those practices look at building the soil organic matter, building the amount of carbon, soil carbon, that is in the top few inches of our soil, and sequestering that, building the soil organic matter, and in that way mitigating climate change. Anytime we can reduce the bare earth that is existent, then we're going to be working on increasing soil organic matter. We're also going to be reducing our albedo, which is the fraction of basically light that is reflected back into the atmosphere. So we want to see maybe some cover crops over winter in the garden to keep a green cover. We want to see plant spacing in the garden or landscape that would provide as much green cover as possible, as much canopy closure as possible, to prevent bare earth and the runoff potential as well, or erosion potential from the garden. The types of mulch that we use can be a mitigation strategy. So if we're using a mulch that breaks down fairly rapidly, that type of mulch is also going to be emitting as much as it might be adding to the soil. So a longer, slower breakdown of the type of mulch also saves us on our bottom line, right? We don't have to then purchase that mulch as much. If we can mow high, then we're mitigating. We're allowing for fewer trips through the lawn to mow. We're allowing for maybe a few more very short plants to produce flowers. If we don't have, that fescue only type of lawn, maybe provide a little benefit to pollinators that Gina's going to talk about afterwards. If we can reduce the lawn surface area by choosing other plantings that might be also more long-term. So if we look at some prairie grass areas, if we look at trees, those are all going to be more sequestering of carbon in our soils than traditional, I use fescue as an example, but Bermuda grass lawn area. And anytime we can plant trees, that's a very long-term strategy. And young growing trees within the first, a 5 to 20-year-old tree in the broad ecosystem is the highest sequester of carbon option that we have in the growing things community. So if we want to look at mitigation in general, not just in the landscape, we reduce our fossil fuel emissions. So not saying you need to cut fossil fuels out completely. And in general, we're never going to cut fossil fuel use out completely. But if we can reduce those total emissions, the fossil fuel emission is the largest portion of greenhouse gas emissions that we have right now. I say eat right here. Basically, the My Plate that the health and human science educators uses a 4-ounce portion of meat as 1 serving of meat. And I'm not advocating vegetarianism or veganism, but I do think one good step is to keep in mind that 4 ounces of meat is a serving of meat. And if we're supposed to get 2 or 3 servings of meat in a day, then 1 trip to Logan's or Texas Roadhouse pretty much wipes out my meat consumption for the day. And then you all are here because you're master gardeners, you're gardeners, you're growing things, and that's great. You're already doing things to mitigate climate change by sequestering some of that carbon and hopefully increasing organic matter for you. So as I wrap up here, I've got 1.5 minutes by my clock. I just want to go very back to broad and say, get fact-based information. You all are sharing information with clientele. Make sure it's fact-based. If you go to a search engine and you use this term here, site:/.edu, in the search engine with whatever you're looking up, that's going to ensure that anything that is returned to you is a website that has a .edu address. So it's going to be fact-based information from a university. So I recommend doing that. And then verify sources of information. If something looks too good to be true, it likely is. I teach at Vincennes University, and this is the first year where I've had a student in the current events portion of my class. I teach ag economics. So it's kind of important that the students know that Tom Vilsack is the new Secretary of Agriculture and things like that. And this year is the first year that I've had somebody use or bring up an article that was just way off the charts on bias. So we had to take a step back and say, okay, what sources of information are reliable? And I use this chart here from Ad Fontes Media. You see Associated Press is maybe the least biased of some of the options. So if we look at the weather community then, or the climate community, the least biased option is the National Weather Service for weather, or for climate, the National Centers for Environmental Information. When we look at private products in the community, the AccuWeather products, the Weather Underground products, Weather Channel, those private products are generally derived from National Weather Service or National Centers for Environmental Information data. So if we see something that looks a little suspicious, those are the two that we go back to take a look at what could actually be going on. And then I don't go into the big story about the second bullet point there, but wherein you see a very aesthetically pleasing piece of information in the weather and climate community, generally I have this hypothesis that the accuracy of that information is a little bit more suspect. So how we overcome some of that hypothesis is to be sure we go back, and if we see a weather forecast, we verify it after the fact. So if you're getting bad information from a bad meteorologist, we need to fix that. We need to make sure that that you're going out, you're verifying the forecasts that you're relying on for use in the garden. And in order to do so, you just go in after the fact, find the nearest National Weather Service station to the forecast that you were using, which is usually at an airport somewhere, and do that for a few days and accumulate the amount of error from these various sources and see which source of information is best, most accurate for you. And if you look at this chart, the National Weather Service ended up having the least error for this particular time frame, and Weather Channel and Weather Underground had the most error. So that's all I've got, and I know I've gone a little bit over, but here's my information. I'll leave this up for another 10 seconds before I stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, Hans, we've got some questions in the chat box for you. What are some specific examples of C4 plants?
Okay, C4 plants are warm season plants. So if we look at lawns, our C4 grasses are zoysia grass and Bermuda grass. If we look at garden plants, there's C4. Sweet corn is C4. Let's see, tomatoes are C3. Basically, in the garden, if you can think of it as a derived grass type plant, it's a C4, and everything else is a C3. So if you look at the entire ecosystem in the world, 85% of plants are C3, and then about 10 to 12% are C4, and then 2 to 3% are CAM, or those cacti type plants.
All right, do you have any recommendations on slowly breaking down mulches?
So I'm a fan of recycled materials. So if you want a mulch that's going to break down very, very slowly, and it happens to be in the landscape, maybe not in the garden, recycled brick chips are going to be pretty slow to break down. Recycled tire material is going to be pretty slow to break down. Some of the I don't like to recommend like the rock or like river rock type materials, basically because those aren't recycled, right? They're just harvested from areas and then they sell them to you. But anything like that's going to be very slow to break down. If you look at the woody type mulches, there are some as well that'll be slower to break down than others. But for the sake of time, maybe I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Can I use sunflower seed shells from the bird feeder as mulch in some areas?
If you have enough of them, you certainly could. However, when you're using a source from that type of material, you would have to be very observant of the fact that you may be introducing accidentally some other seeds into that soil where you're putting that mulch down, and you may have some unexpected things pop up through that type of mulch.
We have one question, kind of just your opinion on millets. So are we going to be seeing an increase in the use of millets as crops, since those are C4 plants?
Sure. I don't know whether we'll see increased use of that on a broad scale, particularly in row crop agriculture, because you have to have a market for that type of crop. But that is a very common C4 type of crop, and something that particularly in the pasture and forage community, I recommend that every grazer have a little bit of their pasture land set aside for C4 plants like millets, teff grass, and some other things like that, so that if we do run into droughty conditions or very high temperature conditions, part of the pasture is still actively growing when the C3 grasses, the orchard grasses and fescues and stuff, would have shut down already. If we look at a garden type atmosphere, millets are good, but they're generally they're like wheat, right? You've got to harvest it, you've got to mill it into flour to use it. So I don't know that many gardeners will take up something that labor intensive.
All right, and one more question here. In a garden with large amount of surface in raised beds, what do you suggest to keep up fertility of the soil without having to buy commercially produced compost every year?
Okay. So my first thought of that is be sure and use as much of your own compost as you can get your hands on. if you have can make some compost areas where you can basically fill up with the leftovers from your own consumption, that's great. But you said you have a large area of raised bed, and it depends on what's around you in your situation. So if you can find a local livestock producer who might have a source of fully composted manure, that would be a situation where that livestock producer likely isn't going to charge you to get rid of that byproduct, and that would be an opportunity. So the opportunities for you exist. It just depends on what you can find in the neighborhood for you to pick up.
Along that line, can eggshell be used safely in compost?
It can be on a very limited basis. And as you look at eggshells and what they provide to a compost, they're an important source of calcium. And most of our soils in Indiana are already pretty good off as far as calcium content. So they're not a significant benefit, perhaps, for most of our soils, but on a limited basis, they can be incorporated in compost.
All right. Well, I would like to just apologize for earlier. I was going to introduce you. Molly and I both had technical difficulty issues right at the same time, at the worst time. That's how that always happens. But we want to thank Hans for his time today. And you can continue to put your questions for Hans in the chat box, and he can see those. So we'll work on, we may be able to circle back to some of those later on. But to go ahead and continue our program, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Gina Anderson. Gina is the Purdue Extension educator in Floyd County, and has done a lot of work with horticultural topics. And we want to welcome Gina and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Abby. So as Abby said, I do a lot with horticulture topics. I've been in Floyd County I'll start my 8th year on May 15th. And since that time, we have done a lot with pollinators. We've installed teaching beehives at my office. So if you have an interest in beekeeping, make sure you hit me up. And we have also started, it'll be 6 years ago this April, an event called Pollinator Day. And that is a large event that we had, the last in-person event that we had. In 2019, we had between 11 and 1,200 people show up at my office for about 5 hours of learning. So through hands-on activities and stuff. Right now, just like Spring Tonic, we were planning to have Pollinator Day in person this spring. We're not going to do it in person this spring. We're going to do a mini virtual one on April 24th. Starting at 9 a.m. And then in the fall, we hope to do our in-person event on September 18th. So please be watching for flyers and other information on that. But today I'm going to talk to you about fall gardening for pollinators. I know we're just into spring and stuff, and you're like, why would we talk about the fall now? Well, we're going to do this. That way we're prepped for the fall season when it comes upon us. Abby, can you tell me that you're seeing the correct screen? Perfect. Just want to make sure, because I'm using a dual monitor here, and want to make sure that everybody's got the right thing. So Lisa Smith, who is a Sunnyside Master Gardener in my neck of the woods, we worked on this presentation, and we can both co-teach it because we kind of both fell in love with learning more about pollinators and how they affect our environment. So who are our native pollinators? Bats are pollinators for the US. They're just not pollinators in Indiana. So they're insectivores for Indiana. But if you like a good adult beverage, maybe that has some tequila in it, then you would want to think a bat. Birds, for us, for Indiana, hummingbirds are our only bird pollinator. And then a lot of our other pollination happens through insects. So our beetles, butterflies, moths, flies, bees, and wasps, those are all our native pollinators. And so what do our pollinators need? Well, just like us, they need water, food, shelter, nesting sites, and overwintering sites. And as we're doing this, we need to think about how do we provide this through the whole season? Because we need pollinators don't all leave us in the winter. They do, some stick around. So how do we provide these features throughout the season? And as we're talking about it, if you want to look up some publications from Purdue, we have a lot of pollinator publications out there. There's some on Indiana pollinator habitat, and then why we should care about these. These can be found on our education store, or you can also contact your local extension educator they may have a copy in the office, or they can send you the link to these publications. So what about water? That's our first thing that everybody needs water to survive. We want to make sure that it's clean and it's a shallow water source with a perch. So not all pollinators can hover above the water and get a drink. A lot of them need to stop and sip the water, and we can provide a perch. If it's a bird bath, you could put rocks in the bottom of it that way the pollinators can land on the rocks and drink. Most of them prefer to go to a natural source such as a pond or a stream, and that's because they're also pulling minerals from those natural water sources, but it's good to supplement. Your bird bath, make sure that you're changing that water out. Don't let it sit there and collect a lot of debris and stuff. Change it out frequently. Have a fountain with a place to perch is always nice. A mister for hummingbirds. So hummingbirds don't actually go to the bird bath to get clean. They prefer a mister, and they're also not going to drink from your bird bath. They like to suck the dew off of the leaves in the morning. So we want to think about those types of things, because pollinators need them, and they need them to make mud. So there are mason bees and solitary bees that create their nest out of mud. Well, if we have a dry spell like Hans was talking about, they're going to go to these water sources, collect some water in their crop, and take it back to a bare spot in the ground to make their own mud so they can make their nest. So it's kind of a unique feature that some of our native pollinators do. Food, always important. I like a good meal, so do our pollinators. And we want to choose native plants for our pollinators. They're 4 times more attractive to pollinators. All right, they're supporting our local ecosystem. So Indiana's done a big push to start removing invasive species from our area. And that's because we need the native plants instead, because they're providing the best source of food for our habitat. They're also well adapted to our local climate. They can handle our soils, which we know vary from really good to really terrible soils. They can handle our rainfall. They also require a lot less maintenance, which I'm all for that. I like to garden, but I also like plants that don't require me to have to give them a lot of care. So in this picture, we have ironweed, which is the purple. Then in the yellow is the wing stem. The blue color on your screen is great blue lobelia, and then goldenrod is in there as well. So this is a great native patch that's going to provide pollen and nectar throughout the season. This is another Purdue publication. This one is really great. It's got a great chart in it of all the different, not all of them, but a good list of native wildflowers, trees, and shrubs, what kind of growing conditions they need in terms of soil, light, water. It'll also tell you what pollinators maybe are attracted to them. So some plants are good for all pollinators. Some are host species for specific butterflies in their caterpillar stages. And this chart's going to tell you all of that. So next we're going to both nectar and host plants for the butterflies and moths. We need this for all of their life cycle, right? And you can kind of search for our area. So Indiana, we have lots of different zip codes. If you're going to the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder, you can put in your zip code, and this would be a great way to search for native plants to your area. This was really done by Doug Tallamy. So if you're familiar with Doug Tallamy out of Pennsylvania or Delaware, sorry, then his team worked on this to make sure that they could identify, a lot of native plants by zip code. So this is the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder. All right, so we want to make sure as we're planting, this spring, I know we're all itching to get outside. The sun is out today. It's not raining. So we want to include a diversity of flower shapes to attract many different pollinators. So not all pollinators are attracted to the same flower shape. If you think about hummingbirds, they have that long beak. They're going to go to flowers that like more tubular shaped flowers. Some flowers that are tubular shaped maybe aren't attracted to hummingbirds, but they're only used by bees that have really long tongues. So these are things to think about. And we want to select a variety of flower shapes just because it is more appealing to a lot of different pollinators. And it adds to our diversity. We don't want a monoculture. We want to be able to really diversify our gardens. We also want to use masses of color to attract pollinators. So in this photo, you have Delphinium and Rudbeckia, and bold masses help bring pollinators in. So some pollinators can see color, some see shades, and if you can have these bold masses, they're easier to find. And it's also better to do these in like clumps of 3. So it's great to have color in your garden, but kind of clump it together and make sure your clumps are about 3 feet wide. If they're dispersed throughout, it's going to take the pollinators a lot more energy to go from flower to flower. So the larger, kind of clump it up into 3-foot clumps, then it's easier for them to pollinate. So in small areas, plant single species together makes it easier for some of those pollinators flying over to find them easier, and it also increases their foraging efficiency. So in this one, we have some bee balm in the background and then some coneflower in the front. We want to include at least 3 species that are in bloom in the spring, summer, and fall. So if we're doing some math this morning, it's a little early for me to be doing some math, but we're talking at least 9 plants. So we want to plant 3 that are going to bloom in the spring, 3 that are going to bloom in the summer, and 3 that are going to bloom in the fall. And we want to choose older varieties. So what we've seen in the industry is, we breed plants because we want to, have a better color, or there's something that one plant has in terms of an aesthetic appeal that we want to see in another plant, which is fine. But as we breed them, they sometimes lose the amount of pollen and or nectar that they used to hold. So using those older varieties is providing the most pollen and nectar possible. And we also want to avoid plants that have like double blooms. They don't provide the right pollen and nectar for the pollinators. So we want to make sure that everybody has access to the pollen and nectar. So we're providing blooms March to October. For some of us in Southern Indiana, that does extend into November. I think I've had a few plants that were still in bloom in the first part of November. So then we're going to practice good gardening practices, okay? So what we choose to plant determines if pollinators will have the food that they need. So as you're planting things, you could think about when things are blooming and write down what you might anticipate seeing on that plant. Also scout your garden and see, throughout the summer, what insects are you seeing or what pollinators are you seeing? And is there one that you want to attract to your garden that you're not attracting now that you want to attract next year, so that you can think about what you want to plant instead? When what we choose to leave in our landscape determines if pollinators will have the nesting and overwintering sites that they require. We all struggle with this. Do we clean up the leaves in the garden stuff? Don't we clean them up? This is to each person's own preference. We kind of joke that maybe if you have your backyard is maybe not as visible to your neighbors and stuff, that you could kind of leave that a little messier than maybe the front of the house. If we're cleaning up the leaves, then we're ruining some nesting sites for our native bees that overwinter here, or some of our spiders and stuff that nest in those fallen leaves. Now, if you've had a disease in your garden, we want to make sure that we do clear those leaves out. We don't want anything that's been diseased, but if they're just leaves from the tree that fell in the winter, we can actually leave those for a while and not worry too much about that they cause other damage, because they're going to provide habitat. We also need to rethink our weeds. Weeds, by definition, is a plant out of place. And it was probably given that definition by settlers who, you know, as they were moving across the country, wanted to put a house somewhere or put a field in somewhere. And then all these native plants were there and they're like, no, those are weeds, they have to go. Butterfly weed, milkweed, ironweed, jewelweed, Joe Pye weed, and ragweed are all really important plants that provide nectar and pollen to our pollinators. So if we can keep some of these, it's a really good idea. So this is our milkweeds. They're the Asclepiaceae species, and they're the caterpillar host plant for monarchs, queen and soldier butterflies, as well as 3 moth species. And many bees and wasp flies and butterflies will use them as a nectar plant. Now, one thing to think about is where you're located at, and if these plants take off, where will they spread? Where I live at, I was going to plant butterfly weed out in my ditch, and then I thought about it, and if those seeds were to go down the ditch, my neighbor has cattle, and if the butterfly weed seeds from my yard got into his field and germinated and grew, I could create an issue for his cattle, because butterfly weed is toxic to cattle. So as we're thinking about these, try to find good places that aren't going to cause damage to your neighbors either. Just something to think about. And if you plant milkweeds, expect them to get eaten. They're supposed to be eaten by the caterpillars. And I have gotten calls before of people saying, oh my gosh, something ate my milkweed. What can I spray on it? And I'm going, it's supposed to be eaten. Whatever ate it, meant to eat it. So keep those things in mind as you're planting milkweed. Ironweed, this is a great source of nectar and a specialist pollen source for several wild bee species. And it's a host species for 3 moths. It naturally grows about 3 to 9 feet. You can pinch it back in June to reduce its size if you need to, but don't cut it all back at once, because if you do that, then you're not leaving the blooms. So be selective when pruning this. It's also deer and rabbit resistant. Excuse me. So if you have a little bit of a deer or a rabbit issue in your garden, this would be a great plant to have there to that maybe is not going to get consumed as much. So jewelweed is pollinated by bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. This one is a unique one in that it's self-seeding. Okay, it typically grows 2 to 5 feet high, and it occurs in some of those moist, semi-shady areas. So this is one that I would find very commonly in wooded areas or along creek or stream banks. We actually have it at our office. So my office is in New Albany, and we have a wetland area, and this grows very well in our wetland area. And it can actually has some unique flowers that are at the base of the leaves that they're self-fertilizing. So there's these little bitty flowers, and I'm going to butcher this name this morning, but I'm going to try. Callistogamous flowers. They're very small. They're about 1 millimeter long, and they're at the base of the leaf. And research has shown that seeds produced by these, they don't need to be pollinated. They're so small and inconspicuous that they're not pollinated by all these other insects, and they're actually self-pollinated. So they're really, and they're helping produce seeds for the plant at a much lower cost than these showier flowers are. Our next one is ragweed. And I know you have allergies in the fall, ragweed gets you all the time, but it's really important as it supports caterpillar development for 54 species of moth. It does provide pollen for bees, and it supplies seeds for birds and small mammals that are getting ready for winter. So it is really important. If you have allergies, maybe you can plant it if you have a larger piece of property somewhere towards the back of the property where it's not going to be as bothersome to your allergies. We also want to rethink our perfect lawn. Prior to our snow a couple weeks ago, I actually had some dandelions popping out, which is a good thing because my honeybees were about ready to burst out of their house. They needed to get some food, and they need those dandelions. So they're an important source of early spring food. Our common violets, and I know I have them in my yard too, and they annoy me. They are host plants to the fritillary butterflies. And plantain is the host plant to the common buckeye and several moths. And bees and hoverflies also visit it. So these common weeds that we have are actually really important to our pollinators. So if you can think about your lawn and maybe not spray your lawn as frequently, or maybe don't spray it at all and just learn to kind of accept these plants in your lawn, then you're going to help the pollinators. And if you have clover, those are also beneficial to our pollinators. So some fall blooming annuals, these would be things that we want to go ahead and think about getting seeds for, are Mexican sunflower, zinnias, and salvia. And I've had these Mexican sunflower. They're really cool. They get between 4 and 6 feet tall. And you may have to support them in the windy, if you're in a really windy area, but they're really cool, and their blooms last a very long time. The monarchs love it. If you're going to use zinnias, do older varieties of zinnias and avoid those doubles because they're not going to have as much nectar and pollen. And the blue salvia is still blooming sometimes in December if it's in a protected area. So these are 3 that can really get you through that fall time period. You can also use pineapple sage and lady in red salvia as a fall blooming annuals in your garden. So here's some perennials. This goldenrod, asters, native sunflowers, Joe Pye weed, bonesets, and blue mist flowers. So again, really important in the fall. If you have these in your garden, you can deadhead or cut back sections of them to induce new blooms and stretch out the season. But again, don't cut them all back at once. If you cut all the flowers off at once to pinch them back and force new blooms, then there won't be something else there for the pollinators to get or the seeds to reset. So here is some up close pictures of the first 3 that we talked about. There's about 60 species of goldenrod in North America. 49 have been identified in Indiana. The tall goldenrod, the late goldenrod, and Canadian goldenrod can be aggressive. So be aware of that if you're thinking about putting goldenrods in, definitely read up on if they're aggressive or not, because we don't want to plant something that's going to take over and then you have to fight it to get it in control. 11 specialist bees only use goldenrods to feed their young. The asters are one of the most important late season pollinator plant groups. The sugar content of their nectar is high. In this photo, this is a New England aster, and it's probably the most recognized, but they come in colors from white, pale lavender, blue to purple, and many do well in the home setting. I have some native white asters that popped up, and I had pollinators all over them last fall. So think about asters. And there are 52 species of sunflowers that are all native to North America, and Mexico. And there are tons of bees, beetles, and butterflies that are attracted to those plants. Finches, small mammals, and other insects will also eat the seeds of the native sunflower. So if we're thinking about not just pollinators, but wanting to help those other small mammals and birds, think about planting some native sunflowers. Here's the next three. So Joe Pyeweed, blue mistflower, and boneset. Joe Pyeweed can grow to between 4 and 7 feet tall. So make sure you have an area that it's got enough space to get that tall. It attracts lots of bees and butterflies in the late summer. Wasps, flies, and moths can also be observed visiting the flowers. And I said wasp, and some of you are like, oh no, I don't want wasp. We call wasps nuisance pollinators, so they're still important pollinators, and it's good to provide some food for them. Blue mistflower is vigorous and it spreads aggressively by rhizomes, and it's also self-seeding. So if you have a naturalized area, then you could put blue mistflower in there and let it kind of do its thing. It only grows to 1 to 2 foot tall. So again, not one of those plants that's super tall, but great for a naturalized area. Bonesets are large, hairy, clump-forming native perennials, and most of our insects really enjoy them. But please note that boneset is toxic if eaten fresh. White snakeroot is a lookalike plant, and it is all parts of white snakeroot are poisonous. So if you're planting things or you're maybe foraging for plants out in the woods, make sure that you know what you're picking up. Is it boneset or is it white snakeroot? Excuse me. All right, so fall is the optimal time for planting for pollinators. And that's because fall is a great time to add native trees, shrubs, sedges, and grasses into our landscape, as well as that's when we're going to be planting our spring blooming bulbs. So I know we kind of missed it right now because we're getting ready for spring, but this is the great time to think about as you're planting your garden, this spring, and maybe sketching out some other new plantings, thinking about what trees and shrubs you want to add in next year. So some of our native trees are oaks, willow, cherry, plums, and peaches. And our oaks are actually really important because they support the most number of caterpillars of any native tree. And you're like, well, I don't necessarily want caterpillars. Well, we do, because a lot of you I know follow the bluebird team and stuff, and caterpillars are needed to feed baby birds. So having lots of oaks around and supporting those caterpillar populations helps support the bird populations. Willows in the prunus family are also host a large number of caterpillars, and they're also important because they're some of our earlier blooming plants in the spring for insects and other things to get pollen and nectar from. So that's why these are really important. Maples, or also box elders, tulip poplar, and eastern redbud are also really important. Maples are really one of the first foods that at least honeybees see. Other pollinators, if they're out flying, will find the maples as well when they're blooming and go harvest the pollen from them. Redbuds also provide some of the earliest nectar in the spring. And tulip poplar is the state tree of Indiana, and its nectar is attracting to both honeybees and native bees. And it's also the host plant for the eastern swallowtail, eastern tiger swallowtail, and the spicebush swallowtail. So if you have some tulip trees, you could be scouting them out for those two butterfly species. So here's some native shrubs, arrowwood viburnum and maple leaf viburnum. And these are really attractive to birds, bees, and butterflies. They also attract other beneficial insects in as well. And the arrowwood viburnum and the maple viburnum are good natives. So they bloom in the summer. So we're planting them in the fall, and they're going to bloom in the summer and help get our pollinators through maybe that summer drought when we don't have a lot of other plants blooming. Service berries and spice bushes are also great for your landscape. They add a nice unique flower. So they have very unique flowers. So they're adding to that interest in your garden. Button bushes and nine barks are also adding pollinator habitat, but a lot of interest. So if you're not familiar with nine barks, they actually have spirea-like flowers, but they add winter interest in your garden. So when they're don't have flowers on them, they actually have an exfoliating bark that adds a lot of winter interest to your garden. Native grasses and sedges. These are really important because they are bunch grasses, and some of our pollinators that overwinter here, they overwinter in the bunch itself. So they might burrow into the bunch of the grass or just below that bunch and hang out in the soil over the winter. Sorry, my allergies are kicked up this morning and I can't seem to keep them at bay. So when we're thinking about native grasses and sedges, sometimes the height or the spread of these plants is a bit concerning. And you can always look for different cultivars of these. So big blue stem tends to grow between 5 and 8 feet tall. It's a really big plant. It tends to fall over backwards and stuff when it gets that tall. But there's a Black Hawk variety and it's shorter and it only grows 5 to 6 feet tall. Prairie dropseed is one that's 1 to 3 feet tall. So if it's reaching that 3 feet tall, depending on where it's at, that may be a problem. But it has one called Terra, and it's 1 to 2 feet tall. Okay, so thinking about, you don't have to have the necessarily big blue stem, but you could be looking at different cultivars or varieties of these plants. So some spring blooming bulbs. I don't know about you, but some of my bulbs are starting to peak right now, and fall's when we plant our spring blooming bulbs. In this photo, we have some snowdrops, winter aconite, which some people may refer to as winter buttercups, crocus, and wood anemone. So these are all great spring blooming bulbs. If you're looking at tulips and you want to plant tulips for pollinators, make sure you choose the species tulips. The showy tulips have been bred for their dramatic appeal, and they actually don't have the pollen and nectar that the pollinators need. So be looking for your species tulips, not the ones that are, all these bright colors or have color breaks in their petals and stuff. So your mid-spring bulbs include grape hyacinths, crown imperial, and the checkered lily. And then we have your late spring bulbs, which is wood hyacinths, ornamental onions, and quamish. And these do really well. They're great. You can see that these are in that bluish to purple category, which we don't have a lot of flowers in. So these kind of add a different color to your landscape, and they're really easy to take care of. And I know we're not thinking about hummingbirds quite yet. We're all just really waiting for that first day of spring. But when the hummingbirds come, make sure that you leave those feeders out through October. So hummingbirds migrate through, and in October, we don't have as many things blooming for them. So if we can leave those feeders out through October, it helps give them that boost of energy that they need to go finish their migration. And if you're worried about leaving it out going, oh my gosh, if I provide them food, they're just going to stick around and they're not going to make it through the winter, that's not going to happen. Hummingbirds have a genetic drive to migrate, but your feeder's not going to change that. But you can put it out to help give them that food that they need to finish their travel. So think of it as aiding them in finishing their migration and not a hindrance that they're going to stay around. And again, rethink your fall cleanup. I haven't even started my spring cleanup yet because I didn't do any fall cleanup. So we're providing nesting and overwintering sites for our native bees and other beneficial insect populations. When we're doing our cleanup, we need to think about what kind of space they need to make it through. A lot of them nest just below the soil surface or within cavities and dead stems and wood. So if we have some plants that maybe have some hollow stems, it would be good to leave those out for the winter to let the insects overwinter in. And the leaf litter provides spaces for butterflies, wasps, moths, fireflies, and beetles to have shelter in. So we want to keep these things, and even sometimes the bats use the leaf litter as shelter. They get caught in a storm or something like that, then they can get under the leaves and stay protected. Here are a couple of publications from the Xerces Society on nesting and overwintering habitats, and then also how to assess your yard, gardens, and parks for pollinators. So this is a couple of great resources from the Xerces Society on really giving a good assessment to your land. And make sure you save those stems and the seed heads. The birds and other wildlife use the seeds during the winter. When you're pruning your stalks back, maybe on your ornamental grasses, cut them at different heights. So when you're cutting them, if you notice the stems kind of taper, so if you cut them all the same height, then only one type of insect can use whatever that hollow stem is. So if you cut them, some lower, some higher, then you're having different diameters opened up, because those insects really have to have a very specific diameter to overwinter in. And you're going, well, how are they going to know this? The insects actually can measure with their feet how big a space is to know if it's the right space or not. And that's why it's important to really have varying heights in those hollow stems. Leave the leaves when you can. They're actually not litter. So most butterflies and moths use the litter for overwintering protection of their eggs. Some queen bumblebees rely on the leaf litter for additional insulation of their underground nest. And to tie it back to Hans, we need organic matter. So leaving your leaf litter is adding to your organic matter. Maybe use it as a mulch. So it's really a good thing to keep in your garden. And provide patches of bare soil for the 70% of our native bees that nest in the ground. So Hans said, we don't want bare soil because, when we're having rain events and stuff, it doesn't help us at all if they're bare, but we do want to have a few patches of bare space for our native bees that nest in the ground. And if you ever run across, bees that are aggressive, more than likely they're not ground nesting bees, but they're hornets. Ground nesting bees are usually not aggressive and they lead solitary lives. So hornets or yellow jackets sometimes I've run across yellow jackets in the ground. They will be aggressive and they're not the native ground dwelling bees that we're talking about in this scenario. You can build a brush pile in an out of the way location, and that provides hibernation sites for butterflies. It's probably going to have some bare soil, so those ground nesting bees can use that brush pile to build their nest under. It offers daytime shelter for fireflies. It supplies food for wood-eating beetles and provides shelter for birds and small mammals. So you can leave some brush piles, kind of in a back corner, and that provides a great habitat. And we also want to talk about rethinking your lighting choices. Many of us have exterior lighting, and it can actually have a negative effect on our nocturnal insects like our moths and fireflies and some of our bees, because they will be attracted to the light. And if they hit the light repeatedly, they can be, they damage themselves because they've done this, but it also makes them easier prey for bats and some birds and stuff. So turn off your exterior lighting where you can, or put them on motion detectors. And it's also a good idea, like if your walkways have lighting around them, which I understand, I need to see where I'm walking sometimes, but I don't need that light on that walkway shining up. I need it shining down. So you can put shades on your lights to make sure the light is shining down where you're walking and not up in where the pollinators are going to be flying at. And also choose LED light bulbs. They have done some research. Calamy and his group have kind of looked at some of this too. And the LEDs, the frequency that they give off is just a little bit different and is not as attractive to most of the insects like our regular bulbs are. And rethink your pesticide use. So pesticides usually kill indiscriminately, and herbicides, if you're using them, are going to kill whatever plants that pollinators are foraging off of. So think about if you need to spray, making sure that we're picking something that is more of a targeted spray. Avoid buying plants that have been treated with systemic pesticides, specifically neonicotinoids. They're very harmful to the bee populations. And follow the label because it's the law. Abby and Molly and Hans and I have to remind people this all the time. That label is a binding agreement, and you are expected as a homeowner and purchaser of the chemical to follow that label at all times. And so with that, we want to thank the Xerces Society and those who contribute at bugwood.org for the photos. And we can take some questions now. And this is our final. If you need some of those resources, I can leave that up for a few minutes so you can write down those references.
All right, so the first question is a request for more information on your pollinator day.
Okay.
So definitely make sure we can share that link when that comes available.
Yep, it'll be ready by the end of the week.
Awesome. All right, do bird baths need to be out in the open?
They don't have to be out in the open. I mean, if you put them somewhere that's a little shaded, that's probably better for the water because it's not going to get as hot and it may not get stale as fast. So, because I don't like water that's super hot, and I'm pretty sure the birds would prefer it not be super hot either. So if it's a little shaded, that's probably a good thing.
Is false aster, aka Baltonia, the same as beneficial as native asters?
No. So we always want to pick our native plants for that.
All right, what pollinators are most important to agricultural crops?
So it depends which agricultural crops are we talking about. If we're talking about corn, it's wind pollinated, so pollinators don't really matter in that regard. If we're talking alfalfa, there's a lot of bees that pollinate alfalfa. So all of our native bees probably work a little bit at alfalfa, which, as a fun side note, just because it's a Saturday, you can thank pollinators for your ice cream, because without alfalfa, your cows have nothing to eat, and you don't have more alfalfa unless the bees go pollinated it. So
absolutely. All right, where is best to plant trees on your property with a well and septic systems?
Oh, well, I think I would look at my map first and know how much area I had to play with before planting. I would definitely plant away from your well and your septic system, because your tree roots are going to cause a problem with both of those. So if they're on one side of your property, I would pick the other side of your property.
All right, we had a question about the difference between a grass and a sedge, and Dolly Foster, thank you for answering that question in the chat. All right, should we clean up leaves before mulch or leave it?
You could just leave your leaves as the mulch. If you mulch a little bit over the leaves, then you're adding that organic matter, because over time those leaves will break down. So I'm going to say it's up to you. But if you're going to put mulch over the leaves, make sure that the butterflies and stuff that are overwintering have had a chance to emerge. Otherwise, you're going to be covering them up and may do some damage unintentionally.
All right. Do chipmunks serve any purpose?
In the grand scheme of things, yes, they serve a purpose as a food for other wildlife. If you're talking in your garden, I guess depending on if you like your plants to be moved or not, they like to move bulbs and stuff, and they help reseed some stuff. If you're having a chipmunk problem, I would suggest putting some red pepper flakes down, the capsium from the pepper flakes. They'll get it on their paws and in their mouth and stuff, and recognize that they don't like the heat and should in turn leave your plants alone. But in the grand scheme of things, chipmunks do have a place in the world, just not necessarily always in the garden.
All right. What is the best time or month to clean up the garden in the spring?
So we had this, I taught for Master Gardeners up in Delaware County the other day, and typically we would say when the days are consistently over about 50 degrees, because by then a lot of our pollinators are out and stuff. But that doesn't allow you a lot of time, because if you watch our temperatures, Hans was talking about climate and stuff, we keep doing this little cycle of we'll hit some 40s and 50s during the day, and then we plummet back into the 30s at night. So decide what area maybe has the most pollinators and start somewhere else and start cleaning that way. If I had the time, I probably would have started a little bit of cleanup this last week when it was nice out, in areas that I know aren't haven't been visited a lot by pollinators, and then work my way around to those areas that have been visited by pollinators.
Okay. All right, question. I have a woodland garden, lots of leaves fall and we leave them over the winter, then we blow them out in the spring. Is this a bad practice?
Nope, because then you're not shredding them. So the more leaves that we can leave as a whole leaf is better than like if you were to go in and shred them up. So just blowing them out, that works. And it's a lot easier and a little less time consuming.
Yes. If mulching over leaves, when would you recommend that we mulch over them to allow butterflies to emerge?
I would say sometime in May when we're consistently warm. So right now I've seen flies out, and my honeybees have left the hive, because honeybees don't leave until it's at least 55 degrees outside to go and forage. And I really don't know what they found, but they were bringing in pollen the other day. Butterflies are a little bit later because they have to wait for more of those flowers to bloom.
All right. Do we have to clean the leaf litter from our garden beds?
No. So as long as your leaves that were falling weren't diseased, you want to leave them. It adds organic matter.
All right. Any other questions for Gina? All right. Well, if you do have any other questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. Before we close today, I do want to put up a few poll questions for you. So this is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to start a poll, and you're just going to click your answer on the screen in front of you. After this poll, I am going to put some links in the chat box for accessing some programs that you can attend or view for more education hours. So if you could fill out or just start the poll, just started it, so it should pop up on your screen. If you could answer those questions, I would really appreciate it. Right, and what I just put in the chat box is, the first one is a link to the Hoosier Hillsides Master Gardeners having a fundraiser through Flower Power. So that is a link to Flower Power. You can order flowers, seeds, bulbs, anything that you might need for your spring plantings. If you would follow that link and order your plants through there, the orders are due by May 1st. Those ship directly to you. But portion of the proceeds do come to Hoosier Hillsides Master Gardeners. So that's a great way to support each other in the Master Gardener world. Also, the second link is a link to the Hoosier Hillsides Master Gardener video lecture series that was filmed in the fall. And that is a set of videos that you can watch. Those are lectures that were recorded by Master Gardeners, and those do count as education topics as well. So you can view those videos and fulfill all of your education hour needs. All right, and if you have any other questions, you can, as always, put those in the chat box. If you can also email me. My name is Abby Heidenreich. I sent out the link, so you can reply to that email if you have any other questions. I will be talking with Hans and Gina, and if they are comfortable, we will be sending out copies of their presentation or the notes from their presentations. And I will just send those out to your emails as well. And, you know, as always, just thank you so much for attending. I would ask that you complete the poll before you leave the Zoom, but we want to thank the Hoosier Hillsides Master Gardeners and the Good Earth Master Gardeners for hosting today and for putting together the speakers. And we hope to see you next year as we plan a spring tonic, and hope that we can see you all there. So thank you so much.